Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Myers, and I am a JDC board member and member of the Archives Committee. I am pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the third program in the JDC Archives series on Jewish women in turbulent times, changes, challenges, and opportunities. Today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Center for Medicine, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. First, a quick word about the JDC Archives. The JDC Archives holds the records of JDC since its creation about 107 years ago. As such, it is one of the most important repositories in the world for the study of modern Jewish history. Visiting scholars from around the world, as well as publishers, journalists, family researchers, curators, filmmakers, and others use our collections for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in the JDC Archives. Today, our speaker is Juliet Golden, who is the director of the Syracuse University Abroad Central Europe program. She received a bachelor's degree in political science from Indiana University, a master's in international relations from Columbia University, and a PhD in international education from the University of Lower Silesia. Her research and teaching center on the politics of memory, the history of women and public health in interwar Poland and the Holocaust, and architecture and public space in Central Europe. Her article, Show That You Are Really Alive, Sara-Zofia Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's Emergency Medical Relief and Public Health Work in Early Interwar Poland and the Warsaw Ghetto, published in Medicine and the Life Sciences and History Journal, is based on research in the JDC Archives. The title of her lecture today is The Fight Against Epidemics in Interwar Poland and the Warsaw Ghetto, Finding Sara-Zofia Syrkin-Binsztejnowa. Our format is that Juliet will present for 45 minutes, and this will be followed about 15 minutes of questions and answers. Please note that your microphones are turned off, and we will take questions via the Q&A function. You can send us questions at any time during the lecture. And now I am pleased to hand it off to Juliet Golden, who will start her lecture. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Jessica, for the introduction. It's a tremendous honor to be here today to talk about Sara-Zofia Syrkin-Binsztejnowa. It is particularly significant to me because it was precisely through the exploration of the JDC digitized archives that I was able to uncover in such rich detail information about this woman medical doctor. Thank you to the JDC and for inviting me, and my special thanks go to Dr. Isabel Rohr for her constant support through the process of preparing today's event. Thanks too to Jeffrey Edelstein and Abra Cohen for their essential work in the background. In these introductory remarks, I would also like to warmly welcome Livia Janowicz, the grandniece of Sara-Zofia Syrkin-Binsztejnowa, who is joining us today. Livia does a great deal to cultivate her great-aunt's memory. Most recently, a 2020 issue of Nashim Journal devoted to women medical practitioners was dedicated to Syrkin-Binsztejnowa and included a very moving contribution by Livia. So let me now share my screen. It was just a few weeks back, at the end of January, that we observed Holocaust Remembrance Day and the 77th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. In starting, I would like to point to another anniversary that took place 9 days prior. 79 years ago, on January 18th, 1943, the Germans began the second deportation action from the Warsaw Ghetto, when an estimated 5,000 Jews were sent to their deaths. Many medical practitioners were captured that day in a sweep of the ghetto. Among them, Sara-Zofia Syrkin-Binsztejnowa, a prominent doctor and activist. Based on multiple accounts from that day, Syrkin-Binsztejnowa carried morphine with her and injected numerous doctors with death-inducing doses prior to taking her own life. This group suicide took place either on Umschlagplatz, the assembly point for transportation to the death camps, or on the train to Treblinka. In the Warsaw Ghetto, Syrkin-Binsztejnowa held visible positions in Jewish self-help networks and in the Jewish council, the Judenrat. Yet she is largely missing from scholarly accounts. One of her contemporaries and friends, Michel Mazur, in his own study of everyday life in the Warsaw Ghetto, called Binsztejnowa one of the major figures in Warsaw Jewry, but fails to mention her again in his book. Similar anecdotal appearances are scattered in a number of studies in published and unpublished autobiographical accounts by Holocaust survivors and in reports made for Oneg Shabbat, now more widely known as the Ringelblum archives. In this talk today, I would like to contribute to the restoration of her biography, her story. In so doing, I foreground a largely unknown chapter in Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's life, her medical work in early interwar Poland. I recount how, utilizing the digitized archives of the American Joint Distribution Committee, I located a vast cache of primary materials on the formative period of Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's medical career. Pulling from hundreds of documents found online, I was able to piece together a more complete picture of this forgotten medical professional from a time when she served on the front lines of public health and hygiene campaigns in Poland. What emerges are not only important details of the central role she played in the battle against epidemics in the aftermath of World War I in a region of Poland, southern Poland known as West Galicia, but also a portrait of a key institution builder who, in the early years of Poland's independence, took the lead in the shaping of the public health system for Poland's Jews, the largest community in Europe and the second largest in the world. My mining of the archives in search of Syrkin-Binsztejnowa began as an unexpected spin-off of a family research project. My grandmother's brother, my great uncle, Dr. Erwin Miklin, was sent to Krakow as a medical commissioner by the American Joint Distribution Committee in 1921. In the aftermath of World War I, the Joint launched a series of relief programs in Eastern Europe to overcome the dire humanitarian crisis resulting from the ravages of two wars, World War I and the Polish-Soviet War of 1919-1921. Typhus and other diseases of conflict and destitution were decimating populations. The Polish Jewish serologist Ludwig Hirschfeld described a crisis of global proportions. Quote, World War, Civil War had provoked the greatest epidemics the world had ever known. The alarm bells warning of a European-wide epidemic and then a pandemic were also sounded in these two articles published in the Washington Post and the New York Times in 1920. In response to the global crisis, the League of Nations Epidemic Commission, working closely with the Polish government, put in place a sanitary cordon along Poland's eastern borderlands in an attempt to block the spread of typhus. As a part of these international containment efforts, the Joint Distribution Committee allocated $2 million for medical relief to supply hospitals, fight epidemics, and carry out a public hygiene campaign largely for the Jewish populations. The relief and reconstruction programs were to be implemented by a medical unit directed to Eastern Europe at the beginning of 1921, made up of medical doctors, public health specialists, a dentist, a pharmacist, and a secretary. Poland was divided into 7 districts, with commissioners setting up offices in the largest towns of each of these regions. 2 of the unit's doctors were assigned to the Baltic region to work in the newly established independent countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and 1 was sent to Romania. Appointed as the medical commissioner for West Galicia, my great uncle Erwin Miklin set up his offices in Krakow, which is where he first met and began working alongside Syrkin-Binsztejnowa. The archives are rich in descriptions of the day-to-day work of the doctors in the medical unit against a backdrop of poverty, epidemics, intercommunal strife, practices of exclusion, and nation building. They document, for example, the destruction of communities by warfare and pogroms. Here is a map documenting the number of buildings destroyed in different parts of Poland. Districts in red and blue suffered the greatest damage. Here we see the areas most impacted by World War I in West Galicia. The archives also contain reports on local epidemic outbreaks and the spread of illnesses. We can all probably recognize this image of an epidemic curve. This one was prepared by Syrkin and follows the spread of the typhus epidemic in West Galicia in 1920. Here's a photo of an emergency sanitary team deployed to an outbreak site. We also find minutes from national meetings and conferences, as well as reports on infrastructure investments made by the Joint aimed at improving access to healthcare and disease prevention. Women are underrepresented in the Joint archives from the period. The majority of the reports in the collections were penned by men as an outcome of what was, in effect, a male-only hiring policy for the medical unit. As a result, qualified female candidates with, in some cases, more experience than their male counterparts at carrying out international medical relief work in war zones were not considered. Yet, while marginalized, women's histories can be recovered. The more I reviewed the documents searching for my family story, the more Syrkin-Binsztejnowa leapt out of the page and demanded attention. This realization led me to return to the Joint's collections in search of her narrative. By placing Syrkin-Binsztejnowa as the protagonist in subsequent searches and seeking out information from other scattered sources, her agency as a foremost figure in the relief efforts in West Galicia in the post-World War I era and in the subsequent launching of the National Jewish Health Organization known by the abbreviation TOZ, T-O-Z, emerged. In order to tell her story, I'll begin with first considering Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's early life and the first steps in her medical career. I then move on to present in some detail her public health work in post-armistice Poland. I conclude by examining Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's emergency medical work in the Warsaw Ghetto through the prism of her early interwar experience. You will notice here the different versions of her name associated with each of these periods. In her early life, she was known as Sora Syrkin, which is the name that appears on her medical school diploma. After World War I, she shifted from her Yiddish first name to Zofia, perhaps marking a transition away from the traditions of the shtetl to her active presence in the newly independent Poland. In the mid-1930s, she adds Sarah to her first name, which may reflect a return to her roots and traditions at a time of erosion of the position of Jews in Polish life in the mid-1930s. So now let's turn to Sora Syrkin's early life and education. Syrkin-Binsztejnowa was born Sora Syrkin on December 15, 1891 in Bielsk, a city in the Russian Empire, which is today known as Bielsk-Podlaski in Poland. She is related to the Zionist theorist Nachman Syrkin, but the precise lineage is not clear. At least 3 of the Syrkin children, 2 daughters and 1 son, went into the medical profession, a reflection of the weight placed on education for both male and females in the family. One daughter, Fanny, became a bacteriologist and during the Second World War emigrated to what was then Palestine. Another brother, Efim, specialized in internal medicine. Due to the quotas limiting the number of Jews accepted into universities, Efim sought a medical education abroad in Switzerland and Germany. Sora Syrkin, however, stayed in Russia and was accepted into the Kiev Higher Courses, a school for women and a medical program affiliated with the medical faculty of St. Vladimir Royal University of Kiev. The Kiev Higher Courses was one of only 7 medical programs open for female students in the Russian Empire. The school also accepted Jewish students. At the time of her studies, every 4th student of the Kiev Higher Courses was Jewish. From this notarized translation of her diploma, we learn that Syrkin was awarded the title of medical doctor on August 16, 1915, at the age of 23. She was among approximately 1,000 women to have graduated from medical school that year in Russia. With the First World War enveloping the continent, after graduation, Syrkin moved to Moscow, where she was employed as a doctor at the Red Cross Hospital, a position that provided her with coveted hospital experience and postgraduate training. She subsequently worked as a sanitary doctor in the municipal health system and as a school doctor. In 1917, after the outbreak of the Russian Revolution, Syrkin returned to Kiev and her alma mater, where she was employed as an assistant in the university hospital, working under Vasily Obraztsov and his pupil Nikolai Strazesko, two pioneer cardiologists who achieved international renown for having, in 1910, described for the first time non-fatal myocardial infarctions in a clinical setting. Here on the left, we see a photo of Obraztsov, and on the right, the image of his student Strazesko on a commemorative coin emitted in 2006 by the National Bank of Ukraine. With civil war raging in Russia and severe unrest across Ukraine, in October 1918, 1 month before the end of World War I, Syrkin departed for Warsaw, the soon-to-be capital of a newly independent Poland. Now I will turn to Zofia Syrkin's work in interwar Poland. The end of World War I brought Poland independence for the first time in 123 years, but the country was devastated economically and physically. Military conflicts with the Soviet Union were ongoing, making the country a breeding ground for deadly epidemics. With the health crisis spinning out of control, in 1920, the Polish government created the extraordinary Epidemic Commissariat headed by a typhus czar or a typhus dictator, empowered with special emergency staff and extraordinary powers to mobilize resources to lead a coordinated national campaign to halt epidemics. A physician draft was enacted and doctors were placed at the disposal of the commissariat. Sora Syrkin, now figuring in the archives as Zofia Syrkin, was mobilized to the army in March 1920 and delegated almost immediately to work under the American Joint Distribution Committee, which had been directing funds and supplies under the aegis of the American Relief Administration since 1919. The Joint sent Syrkin to Krakow at the end of April 1920. In Krakow, Syrkin was charged with the formation of the sanitary section of the Jewish Relief Committee, an institution established in 1919 to coordinate emergency aid efforts in the region in the immediate aftermath of World War I. One of the important tasks of the committee was work with orphans. In Galicia alone, there were an estimated 20,000 orphans. Over the course of 10 months leading the sanitary section, Syrkin's work centered around four main activities. One, surveying the region to understand the scope of the epidemic and set parameters of the medical sanitary response. Two, the implementation of large-scale education and cleanup campaigns. Three, the construction of sanitary and medical facilities deemed critical to halt the further spread of epidemics and to offer improved access to healthcare. Four, developing a network of public health units in communities in West Galicia. The picture emerging from Syrkin's survey of West Galicia was of a region which, in her words, was perfectly helpless before the terrible enemy of typhus. In 1919 and the first 10 months of 1920, West Galicia was hit with 23,279 cases of typhus, with a case fatality rate of 14%. The Jewish population, made up mostly of urban dwellers, was particularly hard hit. 30% of those ill with typhus in Krakow were Jews, but they only accounted for 17% of the overall population of the city. The situation in the countryside was worse. In Syrkin-Binsztejnowa, a town in eastern Galicia where this delousing station was set up, 3/4 of the population lived in overcrowded primitive barracks. In a report from Syrkin-Binsztejnowa, Syrkin described the extreme destitution. She reported barracks where lice were even crawling on the ceiling, and the design of the barracks with narrow corridors and tiny rooms failed to provide a modicum of hygienic living. She described felt-covered walls, and I quote, radically swarming with parasites, end quote. Medical staff removed 300 lice from the head of one girl, aged 12. Central to Syrkin's medical relief work was the launch of a bottom-up effort to stave the epidemic through community education and a house-to-house cleanup movement. Her educational program included the distribution of 60,000 informational how-to flyers in Yiddish and Polish that informed the Jewish residents of West and parts of East Galicia about proper daily hygiene and cleanliness practices. The instruction flyer on the left lists 7 points on how to clean one's home. The flyer on the right discusses specific personal hygiene practices that should be followed, especially in the time of the epidemic. The handouts were written in a language suitable to a range of worldviews and lifestyles. Communiques were published in Jewish newspapers and distributed in Jewish schools and synagogues, as well as from door to door by youth volunteers. Here we see signs with public health information posted on a wall behind starving refugees. Health and hygiene lectures were delivered in synagogues and other public places, and thematic conferences were convened for Jewish community leaders. The heart of the sanitary program was the cleanup movement. Over a period of 3 months, Syrkin led the first in a series of public campaigns to clean up Jewish homes. Jewish neighborhoods were divided into sectors. Trained doctors and medical assistants moved door to door, inspecting Jewish living quarters and the inhabitants. If homes were deemed dirty, a cleaning date was set. The cleaning would be carried out by residents themselves under the guidance of a physician who would arrive on the appointed day with cleaning supplies. Residents received tickets for a free bath at a temporary facility situated in tents in the Kazimierz neighborhood of Krakow. Before showering, bathers were required to hand over their clothes for cleaning and delousing. The clothes would be returned only after submitting proof that the individual had visited the public bath. Over a 4-month period between June 26th and October 1st, 1920, Syrkin's sanitary section inspected 5,748 homes and 26,694 individuals. As this report prepared by Syrkin indicates, inspectors found 62.5% of the dwellings to be either dirty or very dirty. During 4 months, 1,172 homes were cleaned, and 6,394 individuals received baths and had their clothes disinfected. This with a permanent staff of 2 physicians and 1 medical assistant, in comparison to the municipal sanitary office in Krakow, which had a staff of 14 physicians and 14 medical assistants. Within months of its inception, Syrkin's sanitary section launched 2 key investments in Krakow: the night shelter and the ambulatory care clinic. The night shelter was considered to be by Syrkin the front line in the battle against typhus. Syrkin sourced the constant outbreaks of epidemics in Krakow to the influx of refugees, poor travelers, and destitute people entering and moving about the city. Here in this photo from 1921-22, we see refugees moving through the city of Równe. It is important to remember that the battles along the Eastern Front of World War I and later during the Polish-Soviet War spawned a major refugee crisis. And here is a photo of a group of refugees in Krakow. In the photo, we see multiple generations. In the back, mostly men, women in the middle, and in the front, many children. One little girl in the lower right-hand corner is without shoes. Some children are wearing what appear to be caps and jackets from uniforms from different armies. The shoes, some not matched, some too large for the wearer's feet, have been repaired multiple times. In terms of care for refugees in the time of epidemics, prior to the opening of the night shelter, synagogues in particular had been frequently deployed as temporary shelters, creating a significant danger of the spread of lice and a range of communicable illnesses to the locals who in large numbers visited these houses of prayer on a daily basis. Adapted from donated barracks, the night shelter offered the possibility for safe and clean housing. It also doubled as a public bath and a delousing station where 300 people could bathe at the shelter daily. The sleeping quarters could accommodate 192 people, and entering the building happened in controlled stages. Before showering, lodgers would hand over their clothing for delousing in an undressing room accessible directly from the outside. Visitors then passed into the shower room and after bathing, moved into a second clean dressing room where they retrieved their deloused clothing. No direct access to the sleeping facilities were available from the bathhouse and delousing station. All bathers received certificates confirming the date of their bath. The second investment, the ambulatory care clinic, was built to fill in for the lack of a Jewish hospital. The new clinic represented one of the few places Jewish residents could go to when ill. In the first month of the operation in the late summer of 1920, the ambulatory treated 1,255 patients. The Joint's medical unit arrived from the United States at the beginning of 1921. That's when Irvin Miklin, a Russian-born, US-educated medical doctor, was sent to West Galicia to serve as medical commissioner. Formally speaking, the Joint's medical commission absorbed the sanitary section, and Syrkin became Miklin's deputy. In substance, however, the main thrust of the work in West Galicia endured in accordance with the program initiated by Syrkin 10 months prior. Miklin himself noted that when he arrived in Krakow, he was essentially just taking over the reins of a pre-existing operation, a situation not all medical commissioners encountered. The work in this period was punctuated by emergency responses to outbreaks of epidemics of typhus and dysentery and cholera. These responses were led by Syrkin-Binsztejnowa in tandem with Miklin. For example, when a particularly virulent typhus epidemic exploded in the town of Mościska, they assembled a 7-person emergency response team that converged on the eastern Galicia town to combat the epidemic. Thematic conferences also continued. Here is a photo taken during the JDC conference for rabbis to discuss several types of sanitary mikvahs. Within months of the medical commissioner's arrival, the JDC's medical relief program was in turmoil. With the typhus epidemic beginning to abate, the JDC was divided over the long-term direction of its aid program. After traveling around their respective regions and seeing firsthand the devastation of war, the abject poverty, and the shortage of health and sanitary facilities, many of the commissioners urged the Joint to release funds to build public health infrastructures such as hospitals, public baths, and health clinics. Increasingly, however, Joint leadership was reconsidering its options. Infrastructure investments would require long-term entanglement on the part of the Joint, and the rebuilding alone was considered not enough to improve the health and welfare of Poland's Jewish population. The fear was that once the Joint pulled out, progress made in public health matters would backslide without public education programs that would foster local engagement and know-how. As these policy debates were underway, after 1.5 years in Krakow, Syrkin was advanced to the position of a director in the Joint's European offices in Warsaw. She had gained credibility through her handling of the typhus epidemic in Krakow and West Galicia, and more importantly, through her approach to public health, in which she embodied this new policy blend many of the leaders of the Joint were advocating for. From Krakow, she had overseen the rapid construction and operationalization of the night shelter and other sanitary investments, and had implemented a broad educational program throughout West Galicia that stimulated self-reliance in hygiene matters and preventative health practices. In September 1921, she assumed the leadership of the newly established Public Health Education and Propaganda Department. It was from this new post that Syrkin would launch 2 public health initiatives that had far-reaching consequences for Poland's Jews in the interwar period and beyond. The first was the establishment of the National Jewish Health Protection Society, TOS. The second, the School for Nurses, which was closely connected to the launch of TOS. So let us now briefly turn our attention to these 2 important initiatives. TOS was the acronym for Towarzystwo Ochrony Zdrowia Ludności Żydowskiej w Polsce, the Society for the Protection of the Health of the Jewish population in Poland. Within months of her arrival in Warsaw, Syrkin-Binsztejnowa presented a four-pronged strategy, all reflecting her experience in West Galicia, that would serve as the nucleus from around which the Central Public Health Organization would emerge. The main points in her program included plans for: 1, the launch of a national public health education program involving the dissemination of information on disease prevention and hygiene through a variety of means, including public lectures, exhibitions, home visits, and the distribution of printed informational materials. 2, the construction of public sanitary infrastructure that would, in her words, and I quote, enable people to apply in practice the precepts of health and hygiene gospel. A third pillar of her program was tied to the improvement of children's health, emphasizing the need to integrate hygiene training as well as physical culture into school curricula. In a September 1922 report to the Joint, Syrkin wrote, and I quote, "It is one of the saddest results of the war that people have become unsocial and retrograde, and that can be remedied only by means of a moral as well as physical rational training of children. As nearly all Jewish children go to school, the application of hygienic principles in schools is one of the most important points in our program." A special focus of concern was the health and welfare of children enrolled in religious schools. The physical development of children in the Jewish schools, she argued, lagged far behind pupils in public schools where physical education was integrated into the learning curricula. In addition, the health and sanitary conditions of children in religious schools needed to be improved in order to keep the schools open. A new Polish law allowed Jewish pupils to attend heders. However, the schools also needed to pass state sanitary inspections to remain open. Syrkin-Binsztejnowa argued that if hygiene standards were not improved, the schools would close down and children would be forced into a fully secularized education. The fourth point in her program called for the substantial enlargement of schools and training program for public health personnel with an emphasis on nursing education. The shortage of nurses had proven a significant obstacle in carrying out the medical relief work during the epidemics in West Galicia, which mirrored chronic shortages nationwide. According to joint statistics, in 1921, there were 5,000 practical nurses registered in Poland, only 1,200 of which were considered fully qualified, that in a country of 30 million people. The Nurses Training School for Jewish Women was deemed particularly crucial in light of the fact that Jewish women were barred from attending the Red Cross nurses training programs established in Poland, a reflection on how contested the position of Jews and other minorities was in the young multi-ethnic state. In response to these exclusions, Syrkin advocated for the need to establish a school in Warsaw to train Jewish public health nurses. Syrkin prepared a 2-year curriculum modeled after the American system of nursing education. Her proposal was circulated by the Joint among an impressive international consortium of recognized experts in nursing education for evaluation, and she received high marks. An internal Joint memo notes the following overwhelmingly positive response. I quote, "These persons were unanimously well impressed with Dr. Syrkin's plan and considered it sound and practical, as well as in conformity with the best standards of nursing education." After Syrkin's initial proposals, the organization of the school was handed over to the Society for the Support of the School of Nursing, an organization whose sole task was the opening of the school. As we know, the school did open in 1923 and was headed by a nurse educator from the United States, Amelia Greenwald, one of the individuals asked to review Syrkin's original proposed curriculum. We see Greenwald here in the front row center of the photograph. As the Joint was phasing out its medical relief work in 1922, under Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's leadership, a national board of elected representatives from different parts of Poland began working on a charter for TOS, which was submitted for approval to the Polish Ministry of Health in October 1922. After 8 months of negotiations, the charter was finally accepted by the Polish government. Soon after, Syrkin invited delegates to the First National Conference of TOEs in the summer of 1923. We see here a copy of that invitation in Yiddish. As a key driver in the formation of TOEs and a person who had earned inestimable respect amongst joint leadership in Europe and New York, Syrkin-Binsztejnowa was offered the post as top manager, the chairperson of the organization. It is impossible to speculate based on the documents as to her motivation, but she turned the position down. However, she became one of the two founding directors, working under Gershon Levin, who would hold the post of chairman until his death in 1939. On the screen, we see the photo from the First National Conference, which marked the launch of TOEs, attended by delegates from across the country. Fourth from the right, on the front row, we see Syrkin-Binsztejnowa with a pencil and a newspaper in hand. She is one of only two women in the photo. Also on the front row, fourth from the left, we see one of the delegates, Tzemach Shabbat, the well-known Jewish doctor and activist from Vilnius. Next to him, third from the left, we see Gershon Levin, the chairman of TOEs. In October 1923, the medical sanitary department of the Joint was closed down, and TOEs assumed responsibility for all aspects of the Joint's medical program in Poland. On his departure, J.J. Golub, the last of the original team of medical commissioners to leave Poland, was uncertain about the future of TOEs. He called TOEs an experiment at best. But the experiment Syrkin launched with her transfer to Krakow from Warsaw, with her transfer from Krakow to Warsaw worked. TOEs became an expansive national welfare organization with a focus on promoting health and disease prevention through education. TOEs also served as a healthcare provider, coordinating medical care on a national scale. By 1939, there were more than 50 TOEs chapters in larger towns and 41 sub-chapters in smaller communities. I return to this photo shown a few moments ago. It's July 1931, and we are at a summer camp for children organized by the Grodno chapter of TOEs. Children are on a playground. Some of their heads are covered, perhaps due to treatment for infectious skin disorders. In the bottom center, we see the hand-drawn logo for TOEs. Here, we see an excerpt from the 1926 TOEs report on the school hygiene program, which in a few short years had grown to encompass 311 schools and 31,283 children. TOEs ran 368 medical clinics and public health institutions and employed 962 full-time employees, including 243 physicians, 118 nurses, and 35 dentists. Referred to widely as the Jewish Health Ministry, in the interwar period, the organization was twice conferred gold medals for its work at nationwide exhibitions devoted to public health and hygiene. We see one of these gold medal award certificates on the right. Public health education, so important to Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's work in Galicia, remained one of the quote-unquote paramount tasks of TOEs. Over the course of 15 years of its existence before the war, nearly 500,000 people attended TOEs public health lectures. I would now like to turn to the period of World War II and the Holocaust. To open the final section on Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's work in the Warsaw Ghetto, I will start with this photo, not from the late 30s and early 40s, but from the interwar period. Taken between 1923 and 1925, we are in the offices of TOEs. On the wall, we see graphs and charts tied to public health. Also hanging in a prominent place on the wall, on the right, just under the added descriptive label, we see the photo from the 1923 founding national conference that we looked at a moment ago. However, the photographer's attention is on the two people at the desk. Behind the desk is Syrkin-Binsztejnowa, focused on her conversation with Gershon Levin, the chairman of TOEs, who has pulled up a chair for the meeting. This photo will serve to illustrate the words of Dr. Moshe Tursh, a TOS director in the Warsaw Ghetto, who in an unpublished memoir describes Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's unremitting dedication to public health work in the horrific conditions of the largest ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe. It also serves to illuminate the connections between Syrkin's interwar public health work and the Holocaust. In his memoir, Tursh describes Syrkin-Binsztejnowa as follows, I quote, "When the epidemics decimated the Jewish population of Warsaw, Dr. Syrkin-Binsztejnowa could not remain on the sidelines, but instead occupied one of the leading positions in public health in the ghetto, bringing with her, for the good of the cause, her enormous experience from the previous war and her unusual talents." Tursh continues, "Those who worked with her closely were full of admiration for how, from behind one small desk, where once a week doctors in refugee centers submitted their reports, a large department with an enormous reach emerged." With this as a starting point, I will turn now to describe briefly Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's work in the ghetto in hope of making connections to her earlier work in the interwar period. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Syrkin-Binsztejnowa was already retired from medical practice. We know this from a 1938 document stored in the Central Medical Library in Warsaw. No information is given to explain her early retirement. However, the Nazi invasion of Poland plunged Syrkin-Binsztejnowa back into the world of public health, emergency relief work, and the battle against epidemics. From September 1939 to 1940, 90,000 Jewish refugees, POWs, and deportees streamed into Warsaw from the territories annexed by the German Reich, creating an overwhelming housing and health crisis. In late 1939, Syrkin-Binsztejnowa assumed the role of chief physician at TOS, the organization she had played such a central role in creating, taking charge of the coordination of medical care for these evacuees. By the spring of 1940, when the first of two major waves of typhus epidemics broke out, Syrkin-Binsztejnowa transformed what had become a medical sanitary unit serving the refugee centers in the TOS department. By the spring of 1940, when the first of two major waves of typhus epidemics broke out, Syrkin-Binsztejnowa transformed what had become a medical sanitary unit serving the refugee centers into the TOS department for combating epidemics. Tursh details the scope of the department's programs, which echoes many of the public health measures implemented by Syrkin-Binsztejnowa in Krakow and West Galicia almost 2 decades prior. In response to the first wave of the typhus epidemic, the department organized sanitary columns that would delouse typhus-stricken apartments. Because the epidemic was linked to the influx of new refugees to the Jewish district, the department also opened a public laundry earmarked to serve these refugee shelters. Simultaneously, on the prophylactic front, a broad-scale public information campaign was carried out, impressing on the inhabitants the importance of upholding personal hygiene despite the inhuman conditions and chronic shortages of cleaning supplies. In January 1941, Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's department was absorbed into the German-controlled Jewish Council, with her Department for Combating Epidemics serving as the foundation for the formation of what would become the Health Department of the Judenrat. In addition to holding the position as a director in the Health Department, Syrkin-Binsztejnowa also headed the Office of the Inspector of Hygiene. In the Judenrat, she worked under Dr. Israel Milejkowski, with whom it appears she had very close professional connections. She also maintained close ties with another ghetto activist, Dr. Jakub Rosenblum, the disabled yet determined Secretary General of TOS. One of her important initiatives in the 9-month tenure at the council included the founding in June 1941 of the Chemical and Bacteriological Institute, a laboratory and research facility which, among other undertakings, carried out food testing to help prevent and control food-related illnesses and disease outbreaks in the ghetto. It also served as a place to test vaccines reaching the ghetto, oftentimes clandestinely, to determine their quality and effectiveness. Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's time as the director in the health department of the Judenrat came to an abrupt end following one of the most brutal of the German blockades and mass delousing campaigns, the Krochmalna Street action. Krochmalna Street was an overpopulated and particularly impoverished neighborhood, even by ghetto standards, and was considered a sanitary problem and a source of infectious disease. Here is the photo of Krochmalna from the interwar period from the JDC archives photo collections. On August 28, 1941, at the height of the second typhus epidemic, German, Polish, and Jewish police, joined by members of the German Health Office, Polish doctors, and physicians of the Judenrat, including Syrkin-Binsztejnowa, sealed Krochmalna Street. Residents were driven out of their homes and into the streets to wait their turn to be led to the public baths. During the delousing of buildings, apartments were ransacked by sanitary brigades in search of anything of value. By nightfall, no food or water had been distributed to the residents, and 800 people remained in the public square, awaiting their turn to visit the bathhouses. When soup was finally distributed to the starving residents 24 hours after the raid had begun, it was dished out into caps, fragments of clothing, and even into cupped hands due to the shortage of bowls and utensils. Dr. Wilhelm Hagen, the German health office official for the Warsaw district, and by most accounts, the chief architect of the Krochmalna Street debacle, passed culpability onto Syrkin-Binsztejnowa. In a meeting with Adam Czerniaków, the chairman of the Judenrat, on September 15, 1941, Hagen forced Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's dismissal from the health department. For the next 14 months, Syrkin-Binsztejnowa remained active with TOS, and from some reports was captured in the line of duty with other medical professionals and activists and committed suicide with them on January 18, 1943. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that the digitization of the JDC archives allowed me to bring back the erased history of Zofia Syrkin-Binsztejnowa and her remarkable contributions to public life in interwar Poland. She was a woman medical doctor, a forceful institution builder, and an effective social activist. Institutions such as TOS and the School of Nursing are her lasting legacies. The insights gained from Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's emergency medical work and from the formation of public health institutions in interwar Poland allow us to better contextualize her public work in the Warsaw Ghetto. While the two eras are distinct, as Tursch indicates in his memoirs cited above, it was precisely Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's experience organizing the anti-epidemic campaigns and TOS in times of profound humanitarian crises after World War I that help us understand how she came to assume leadership roles in formulating medical relief and public health responses to the Nazi occupation. Scholar Dalia Ofer writes that in the Warsaw Ghetto, Syrkin-Binsztejnowa was, and I quote, a most creative personality in a most desperate situation. The JDC archives clearly show that these words are equally apt when considering Syrkin-Binsztejnowa's early interwar work on the front lines of the disaster response in West Galicia and later in building TOS. I'll stop there and leave time now for any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. That was so fascinating. I'd never heard of her before, and wow, what a heroine, what a story. I just want to remind everyone that we're opening the floor to questions. Your microphones are turned off, so please type your questions into the Q&A function. So Juliet, I'm going to start with two more medical type questions about what was going on. So the first one is, what pharmacology treatment was used for the elimination of head lice, scabies, and typhus?
To be honest, I'm not completely, I don't know the answer to that question. I'd have to research that specifically. I think I read something about it one time, but I do not have it on the top of my head right now.
Absolutely. And then there are actually quite a few questions coming in about her personal life. She has a double name, which it makes us think she got married at some point.
Yes.
Can you please talk a little bit about her personal life and a little bit about that, please?
Yes, it's quite unusual for her to have a double name, especially that form, the Binsztejnowa is an unusual name. I don't have the exact date of her marriage, but I estimate that she was married by 1920. In the photograph that went with this invitation, you see that she's wearing a wedding ring on her right finger. She married Joseph Binsztejn, who he was not a medical doctor from what my understanding from the little information that I can find about him. He was, I believe, involved in the lumber industry, perhaps in forestry management. She was separated from him when she went to Krakow. His base was Warsaw. And so one of the motivations for her return to Warsaw was to be able to be with her husband because she'd been separated from him presumably shortly after her departure, after their marriage. There was information that he died in the ghetto with her on January 18th. One document from the JDC archives indicates that he was with her till the end, but there's very little information about Józef Binsztejn.
I also wanted to let you know there's quite a lot of bravos and fascinating, and people really enjoyed your lecture, so thank you.
Thank you.
To a little bit more about her family. Do you know anything about her parents or her siblings? You know, the person phrased the question, what were the family dynamics that produced a person, like this, such caliber?
Yes, for me, one of the sad things as a researcher is that I don't have what's often called ego documents. I don't have personal information about her that she wrote about herself and about her family. I only have the information about about what the family did and what the family achieved. I think she came from a traditional home, but I also think she was a person that embraced modernity. And as I said, education was just very important. I also think that the family was very tight, and also the education, that everybody left home for their education. The brother went to Breslau and then Bern in Switzerland for his education. She went to Kiev, which was quite far. The only other thing I can point to is that she was related to Nachman Syrkin, who was politically engaged, a Zionist theorist. So perhaps that gives some indication about her family and their sort of social engagement.
Right, that makes sense. And are there any books about her that you know of?
No, there are no books about her. There's really very little information about her. As I said at the very beginning, there is only anecdotal information about her. There have been a few articles that have talked about certain aspects of her work. The Polish Center for Holocaust Studies in Warsaw, who I'm incredibly indebted to for their work on the Warsaw Ghetto. They provide information on Syrkin-Binsztejnowa and some of her activeness in the Warsaw Ghetto. Also, the Ringelblum archives, the Onik Shabbat has some information about her, but no, there have been no books written about Binsztejnowa.
So those few sources you just mentioned, plus the JDC archives, were your primary places for research?
Absolutely. And it was the digitized archives that really allowed me to fill in that information. I would also say the Central Medical Library in Warsaw had some vital information for me that she prepares in one questionnaire. She provides a biographical information about her studies, and the diploma was attached to that document. So that gave me some really vital information about her earlier life and about her name and about her family, her parents' names. And I would say, I do not know when her father died, but in one document from a sister that was in Palestine after the war, she writes that some information came out that the mother was still alive and was in Bielsk during the war and presumably was murdered.
And there's a question about getting medicine into the ghetto. How did she get that morphine? Did the Nazis allow medicine to come into the ghetto?
That depends. In different periods, in my understanding, there were different periods where medicine was imported. The Toz was able to work internationally, and I believe through Switzerland, to get supplies into the ghetto. But once the United States entered the war, that became a problem. I think that there was a mixture of some medicine was smuggled into the ghetto. We know that from the vaccines, from the institute that she created, the laboratory that she created, one of the reasons why they wanted to test the vaccines was that they had been smuggled into the ghetto. So they don't know whether they didn't have any information whether vaccines were legitimate or not. So that's one of the tasks. So I think it was a mixture of purchasing and smuggling things in, but also amassing materials when it was possible for the supplies to be brought in. There was a period where the Germans were allowing for these to come in, but not all of the supplies designated for Jewish health workers in the ghetto arrived there. Of course, they were taken along the way and used elsewhere.
Gotcha. All right, so I think we are almost out of time, but I just wanted to say, somebody said that this incredible woman needs to be far better known. Perhaps you will write that much needed book about her.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that vote of confidence. Thank you.
Yeah,
and I agree that attention needs to be put on her even more than I have done so far.
I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions, but we're due to end in about 1 minute. So I just wanted to conclude and say thank you so much, Juliet, today for your presentation. It was fascinating and really wonderful. Thank you to our participants for joining us today. I hope you all enjoyed this program. It sounds like you did. And I want to extend our gratitude to the Center for Medicine, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles for co-sponsoring today's lecture. Our next webinar, the Helen Cohen Memorial Lecture, will take place on March 30th. Laura Hobson-Four will present her newest book, The Jewish Marshall Plan, the American Jewish Presence in Post-Holocaust France. You can register for it via our JDC Archives Facebook page or the JDC Archives website. We hope that many of you will be able to join us. You can also sign up for our e-newsletter if you would like to be added to our mailing list for public programs. And with that, I will conclude and say thank you, Juliet. Thank you to the JDC Archives, and I wish everyone a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.